Doug. The hearing will come to order. The committee will come to order. Welcome everybody to the Budget Committee. The purpose of this hearing is to review the long-term budget outlook, which CBO just recently released, and unpack the fiscal and economic damage and challenges facing our nation. We're joined today by no stranger to this committee, Doug Elmendorf, Director of the Congressional Budget Office. I want to thank you for testifying again today, Doug, and for the work your team has done in putting together this report. The report is sobering, and the warnings are dire. You write in the report, quote, "Growing debt would increase the probability of a sudden fiscal crisis, during which investors would lose confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget, and the government would thereby lose its ability to borrow at affordable rates," close quote. What's causing this growing debt? Government spending is on a breakneck pace. By 2025, according to this report, health spending, including Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt will consume 100% of revenues. Tax revenues that continue to increase each and every year. The problem, of course, is unsustainable increases in government spending. Our entitlement programs, in particular government spending on health care, are the core drivers of the debt. As the report makes clear, the health care law fails to address the cost problem and instead adds new liabilities to an already bankrupt future. Those unwilling to structurally reform a structurally broken government repeat the same calls for ever higher taxes to chase ever higher spending. On the question of taking more from hardworking taxpayers, CBO's report is clear, writing that, quote, "The extent that additional tax revenues were generated by boosting marginal tax rates, those higher rates would discourage people from working and saving, further reducing output and income," close quote. CBO, like all nonpartisan experts, has again warned of delay in solving our fiscal problems. Unfortunately, the administration has no definitive solution to the problem we face, but merely obstruction for those who do put forth good faith solutions. The Senate, of course, hasn't passed a budget in more than 3 years. House Republicans refuse to accept the European-style debt crisis, which promises harsh austerity. We reject the empty promises and continued inaction in the face of a crisis. Cranking up tax rates that further stifle growth and harsh disruptions to beneficiaries is what Europe is doing right now. This does not have to be our fate. This is why we continue to advance gradual, common-sense reforms to lift the debt, strengthen core priorities, and spur job growth. We still have a window of opportunity that will require us to come together to solve this problem. CBO has presented us with their analysis, but it is incumbent upon policymakers to respond to their findings with principled solutions. It's our moral responsibility to work together to chart a sustainable fiscal path, to revitalize economic growth, and to expand opportunity now and for generations to come. I want to thank you for coming again today, Doug. We look forward to your testimony and lots of questions from the members. And with that, I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join the chairman in welcoming you, Dr. Elmendorf. And 2 weeks ago, you and your colleagues at the Congressional Budget Office released an analysis of the economic impact of the so-called fiscal cliff, painting a very somber picture of what might happen if Congress fails to address expiring tax cuts and the looming automatic spending cuts that occur at year's end. You predicted a possible recession early next year and millions more out of work if we were to actually go over that fiscal cliff. Yet your long-term outlook, CBO's long-term outlook, which we're discussing today, also confirms that continuing to do business as usual, extending all current tax and spending policies, will produce unsustainable deficits and debt, which will also hurt the economy in the long run. Taken together, the two CBO reports reinforce the fact that Congress must adopt a two-track strategy of, one, acting now to boost our fragile economy and help put more Americans back to work, and number two, acting now to put in place a balanced approach to long-term deficit reduction that doesn't take resources out of the economy in the near term. This is the opposite approach of those who advocate for immediate, steep austerity measures, the type of measures that have been pushed by some of our European partners, like the UK, and put them back into a recession. On the first step, putting Americans back to work, We need to enact the President's jobs plan that the White House sent to the Congress 9 months ago. That proposal includes significant new investment in building roads, bridges, transitways, and other needed infrastructure. At a time of over 14% unemployment in the construction industry and super low interest rates, this should be a no-brainer. We call upon Speaker Boehner to put the President's jobs proposal to a vote on the floor of the House. The second step is for lawmakers, the Congress, the President, to adopt a plan to reduce the deficit in a balanced way by applying the kind of framework of spending cuts and revenues generated by eliminating certain tax breaks that has been recommended by bipartisan groups like Simpson-Bowles. That plan should extend tax relief for working families and replace the sequester with a balanced approach to deficit reduction so our economy does not go over the fiscal cliff. Unfortunately, the Speaker's threat to let the nation default on its debt if Republicans cannot impose their European-style austerity plan is cementing the view in capital markets that lawmakers will fail to reach an agreement before the end of the year. That manufactured crisis creates uncertainty that will undermine confidence and weaken the economy. The Standard & Poor's downgrade of the U.S. credit rating last year was due to forecasts of continued political gridlock. Yet for many in the House of Representatives, compromise remains a dirty word. Mr. Chairman, we look forward to having a willing partner, willing to make the necessary compromises to both make sure our economy kicks into full gear and also develops a balanced plan to reduce the deficit over the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Halen. I also ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to insert their statements in the record if they choose to do so. Dr. Elmendorf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan, Congressman Van Hollen. To all the members of the committee, I'm pleased to be back today with you to talk about the long-term budget outlook. In the report that CBO released yesterday, we assessed that outlook under 2 very different sets of assumptions about future tax and spending policies. The extended baseline scenario reflects the assumption that current laws generally remain unchanged. That assumption implies that lawmakers will allow tax and spending policy changes that are scheduled to occur to actually do so. In contrast, the extended alternative fiscal scenario incorporates the assumptions that certain policies that have been in place for a number of years will be continued, and that some provisions of law that might be difficult to sustain for a long period will be modified. Thus, the scenario maintains what some analysts might consider current policies as compared with current laws. The budgetary and economic outcomes under these 2 scenarios would be starkly different. Under the extended baseline scenario, that is, current law, federal debt would decline gradually relative to GDP over the next 25 years, from an estimated 73% this year to 53% by 2037. Though the outcome would not be dramatically different from our current situation, there would be a sharp change from the nation's historical patterns of taxes and spending. Revenues would rise steadily relative to GDP, owing to several factors: the scheduled expiration of cuts in individual income taxes enacted since 2001, the growing reach of the alternative minimum tax, the tax provisions of the Affordable Care Act, the way in which the tax system interacts with economic growth, demographic trends, and other factors. Altogether, revenues would reach 24% of GDP by 2037, much higher than has been seen in recent decades. At the same time, federal spending on everything other than the major health care programs, Social Security, and interest would decline to the lowest percentage of GDP since before the Second World War. That significant increase in revenues and decrease in the relative magnitude of other spending would more than offset the dramatic rise in spending on health care programs and Social Security. That's why debt would decline relative to GDP under current law. In contrast, the outlook for debt is much bleaker under the extended alternative fiscal scenario. As I said, in that scenario, the assumption is that government maintains the kind of tax and spending policies that we've been accustomed to. In that scenario, all expiring tax provisions, with the sole exception of the current reduction in the payroll tax rate, are assumed to be extended through 2022, And after 2022, revenues are assumed to remain at their 2022 mark of 18.5% of GDP, just a little above the average of the past 40 years. On the outlay side, this scenario assumes that the automatic reductions in spending required by last year's Budget Control Act will not occur, that certain scheduled reductions in health care spending will not occur, and that federal spending on everything other than the major health care programs, Social Security, and interest would return to its average share of GDP during the past 2 decades. Altogether, in the extended alternative fiscal scenario, revenues would be much lower and non-interest outlays somewhat higher than in the extended baseline scenario. As a result, federal debt would grow rapidly from its already high level, exceeding 90% of GDP in 2022 and approaching 200% in 2037. Because the extended alternative fiscal scenario is roughly representative of the fiscal policies that are now or have recently been in effect, the explosive path of federal debt under that scenario underscores the need for large and timely policy changes to put the federal budget on a sustainable course. I'd like to take a few more minutes to highlight 2 specific implications of these projections. First, it is not possible both to keep taxes at their historical average share of GDP and to keep the laws unchanged for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The reason we can't repeat that historical combination of policies is that the aging of the population and rising costs for health care have made those large entitlement programs much more expensive than they used to be. It is possible to keep taxes at their historical average share of GDP, but only by making substantial cuts relative to current law in the large entitlement programs that benefit a broad group of Americans at some point in their lives. Alternatively, it is possible to keep the laws for the large entitlement programs unchanged, but only by raising taxes substantially on a broad group of Americans. Changes in other federal programs, besides the large entitlements, can affect the magnitude of the changes needed in taxes or the large entitlements, but they cannot eliminate the basic trade-off I've just described. Even if spending on all of those other programs, including national defense and a wide variety of domestic programs, fell to a smaller share of GDP than we've seen since before the Second World War, debt would still be on an unsustainable upward trajectory without substantial changes in taxes, the large entitlement programs, or both. The second implication of the projections that I'd like to emphasize is that keeping federal deficits and debt no larger than we project under current law would involve difficult policy trade-offs. Under current law, as captured by the extended baseline scenario, we expect that debt will decline slowly relative to GDP in 2015 and beyond. Such a path for debt would gradually reduce the crowding out of private investment caused by high debt. It would restore lawmakers' ability to use tax and spending policies to respond to unexpected domestic or international challenges. And it would reduce the risk of a sudden fiscal crisis, during which investors would lose confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget, and the government would lose its ability to borrow at affordable rates. But even on that path, debt in 2037, 25 years from now, would still be larger relative to GDP than any year between 1956 and 2008. So that path for federal debt might not be optimal. In fact, analysts don't know what level of debt is optimal. But it is one path that might be considered a plausible goal for federal policy. Attaining that goal, though, would pose significant trade-offs. Trade-offs that are exemplified by the decisions confronting you as various provisions of law expire or take effect at the end of this year. To keep the nation on that current law path of declining debt, any actions by the Congress that would significantly worsen the budget outlook relative to current law would need to be offset or paid for by other actions that would improve the budget outlook by a comparable amount. For example, removing the automatic spending reductions under the Budget Control Act would raise deficits by about $1 trillion over the next decade. And extending all of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts and indexing the AMT for inflation would raise deficits by about $4.5 trillion over the next decade, both figures excluding the effects on debt service, I should say. Making such changes to current law while maintaining the same path of declining debt as under current law would require other changes in policy that would reduce deficits by roughly $1 or $4.5 trillion. To be sure, the Congress might not enact those changes in law, or it might choose to allow more debt than would occur under current law, or alternatively to reduce debt more quickly relative to GDP than would occur under current law. There are many possible combinations of policies you might pursue, and CBO will make neither recommendations nor predictions about them. My point is simply that the path of debt under current law would still leave debt at a historically high level relative to GDP. And yet, achieving even that path would require very large changes in current policies. You and your colleagues, and all of us as American citizens, face hard choices. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Okay, so first, I think it's very constructive that we have what we call the alternative fiscal scenario, because that sort of more reflects current policies. But just to get it clear, when we talk about current law baseline, the extended baseline, that assumes a 30% cut to doctors starts January. The discretionary caps stay in place, and the sequester is enacted on top of that, and a $4.4 trillion tax increase occurs in January as well.
Includes the expiration of all the provisions that expire under current law and the imposition of all of the new things that will happen under current law. So that's not very realistic. So it's very helpful to have this AFS, the alternative fiscal scenario. And as we look at this alternative fiscal scenario on your table 2.1 and figure 2.1, when we're doing real GNP per person and long-term budget scenarios on real GNP and GDP, you have a range of estimates, and I'm very intrigued with these range of estimates. First of all, on one of them, over on your GNP per person, that's how we basically measure standard of living. You know, how much does the economy grow per person into the future? And what's great about our nation is we've always had an increase in standard of living. We've always given the next generation a better standard of living, better growth. I'm looking at your lower estimate, which shows in the 2030s, that goes away. And down in your footnote, and we've looked at your models on this before, you say that debt would reach 250% of GDP by 2035 under these assumptions. CBO's model cannot reliably estimate output after debt reaches that amount in the agency's judgment, which means the model can't measure the economy going on beyond that point. Wasn't it at 200% of GDP in your assumptions a year ago? Where is the difference? Because if I recall, when we had these conversations with your predecessor and with yourself, I know this is a technical thing, but I'm just curious, where do you lose confidence in measuring the economy going forward once debt reaches these kinds of levels? And did you not move that out to 250 from 200? No, so we didn't change that, Mr. Chairman. If you look in last year's long-term budget outlook, we show the effect of then the alternative scenario on GNP out at that point to 2035. And in 2035, we thought that including the dynamic effects of rising debt on the economy and thus on the budget, the debt would be 250% of GDP. And we show that on page 32 of last year's report. And there's no magic point at which the model stops working. Our view is that the model...
It just loses credibility after a certain...
Right, it's estimated based on historical experience. And at some point, our debt would, under these scenarios, would move so far out of historical experience that we don't trust the model to be reliable. It's also true that in various parts in the reports, we just cut off the vertical axis. We cut off the picture at 200 or 250% of poverty because we don't think it conveys useful information.
250% of GDP, you mean?
I'm sorry, GDP. Right. We don't think it conveys useful information to you, even if we can, in a sense, run the calculator further out.
So what that means is, in the 2030s, we don't think we can measure the economy going forward because of the debt burdens with any degree of confidence.
By the end of the 2030s, yes. Beyond the middle of the 2030s, yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, now then let me ask you about interest rates. In this, first of all, our 10-year, the yield curve is incredible these days, and part of that, I think people would say, is because we're sort of the port in the storm, we're the safe haven. I think it went down as, the 10-year note went down as much as 1.5. You predict interest rate increases, but those long-term rates are still under the past trends. What happens if rates don't stay as low as you're projecting? What is the kind of rule of thumb you use on a rolling average, say, 10-year basis if rates don't stay as low as you're predicting? That's one of my biggest fears is interest rates rise whenever, medium, long term, above trend, like they did in the 1980s or even at the 1990s levels. And what does that do to us? And how does that move those dates up?
So at the end of the first chapter of the report, we talk about a collection of risks that surround these projections. And you should take those risks, you should take that uncertainty very seriously. And one source of risk we point to, as the chairman is mentioning, is the risk of much higher interest rates. Also possible rates would be lower than we project. We note here that if interest rates under this extended alternative fiscal scenario, net interest would be 27% of all federal outlays by 2037 in our projections here. But if interest rates were even half a percentage point higher on a sustained basis, then the debt service costs would be even higher. So, for example, we think that federal debt would be 215% of GDP in 2037, not the 199% of GDP that we show given the interest rate path we've assumed.
Now, let me get you, I was intrigued also with your comments on marginal tax rates. You're saying that the higher marginal tax rates go, the less output and economic growth we get. So is a good combination of fiscal policies, in your judgment, based upon what we're seeing here, lower debt levels, which increases output, and keeping marginal tax rates low? If they're not a trade-off, in meaning if we get savings which reduces the debt from entitlement reforms and other reforms and better economic growth, is not the virtuous cycle we want to get on? I'm not asking you to give me a policy judgment, but I'm asking you, in your judgment, do we get better economic growth with lower tax rates and lower debt levels?
Yes, so all else equal, lower tax rates mean more economic output. All else equal, lower debt means more economic output. Whether all else is equal, of course, depends on the combination of policies that Congress would adopt. The alternative fiscal scenario has lower tax rates than the baseline, but much more debt.
But much more debt.
By our estimates, the much more debt is a stronger negative force than the lower tax rates are a positive force.
Yeah, that's basically the essence of our approach, which is keep tax rates low to maximize economic growth, but deal with the spending drivers of our debt, because as we can see here, even under the AFS, revenues go up. It's just that spending goes up at such an incredible clip because, as you mentioned, demographics, health inflation, and the rest. If we can get that under control, then we can grow. So if we keep our debt levels at or below where we are over the long term and keep our tax rates at or below where we are, we will avoid this kind of projection that you're showing us in these various scenarios in the 2030s, where debt gets so high that you can't track growth going forward. Meaning we can dodge this austerity bullet if we get those two combination of policies in place. Is that not an accurate takeaway?
So I agreed with you up to the point about dodging the austerity bullet.
Yeah.
I think it depends whether you
I guess we defined austerity, right.
To get there. But yes, you're right that if debt stays at or falls lower as a share of GDP and tax rates are lower, that combination would be the best combination of those two features of the budget for growth in the long run.
Okay, let me get one more question on the fiscal cliff. Is it your judgment that how much do you disaggregate between the recession that you're projecting, which I believe you're projecting a two-quarter drop in output, if the quote-unquote fiscal cliff occurs, how much of that, in your judgment, results from the tax side of that fiscal cliff versus the other parts of that of the cliff, the spending issues?
Well, a larger share of the tightening of fiscal policy between this year and next comes on the revenue side. Now, the effects of specific changes in revenues and spending won't be exactly the same on the economy in the short run.
Right.
But altogether, we think that the revenue increases are the larger factor in restraining economic growth and employment at the beginning of next year.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just pick up first where the chairman left off with some of his hypotheticals, because he asked you if you were able to keep tax rates low, given everything else being equal, what would be the result, assuming also that debt remained low. But Dr. Elmendorf, as you said in your testimony, all this involves very difficult trade-offs. So to the extent that we keep debt low and we reduce revenue, that means that we have to cut much more deeply into other areas. Is that right?
Yes.
And given the fact that health care costs are increasing rapidly, especially Medicare, it would mean that we have to come up with another way of dealing with Medicare costs. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And, just to go back to the CBO analysis of the House Republican plan with respect to creating a Medicare voucher, premium support, whatever you want to call it, my recollection is that the CBO analysis showed that it really just shifted a lot of the rising health care costs off the Medicare program and onto seniors. Is that not right?
In the analysis we did a year ago of the plan that the chairman put forward at the time, we did analyze, try to offer some rough estimates of the shift of costs to beneficiaries.
Right. And
in this year, we weren't able to do that kind of analysis. The plan was different and more complicated, and we've not been able to do a comparable analysis yet this year.
That's right, and I think in the chairman's plan he changed some of the things which may have somewhat softened the impact, but my understanding of reading of the CBO analysis last time is the same dynamics are at play, and while it may somewhat reduce the amount of risk and cost shift to seniors, it doesn't eliminate that problem. Have you had a chance to look at that?
We have not been able to analyze that plan.
Okay. If I could just put up a chart, because I think it's important as we discuss the deficit challenge that we have an idea of what components are driving it. And what you see here is this is the deficit, the debt as a percent of GDP. And what you see is beginning in 2001, you have that black bottom line going down very steeply. That was CBO's projection of surpluses at the time. In fact, about $5.6 trillion in projected surpluses. We know that by the end of 2011, we had one of the worst reversals in fiscal fortunes we'd ever seen, and you see the debt rising as a percent of GDP. And what this chart shows is the different components of it based off of the CBO numbers, the deep red being the result of the recession and the economic downturn, the pink being the result of the 2001-2003 tax cuts. And Dr. Elmendorf, I'm going to ask you and your colleagues to take a look at this just to confirm that this breakdown is accurate. But what it shows, I think, is a very simple lesson, which is that in order to get ourselves out of this long-term fiscal challenge, we not only need to deal with the spending side of the equation, but as your testimony makes clear, we should also deal with the revenue piece. When's the last time we actually had a balanced budget?
I think that was 2000.
2000. And do you remember what revenues were as a percent of GDP in the year 2000?
20.6%.
And what are revenues as a percent of GDP today?
They're a little under 16%.
Right. So almost a 5 percentage point GDP swing. Is that right?
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
So again, I want to get back to the fact that we, in the Democratic alternative budget, proposed a balanced approach that combines needed cuts. And I would remind my colleagues that as part of the Budget Control Act, we cut $1 trillion over the next 10 years. But our proposal also deals with the revenue side of the equation, because if we don't get our fiscal house in order, as Dr. Elmendorf said, in the out years, you do have this crowding out effect, which slows down the economy. In fact, Dr. Elmendorf, as you pointed out, the alternative fiscal scenario has lower revenue, correct? excuse me.
Much lower than under the extended baseline.
Under the extended baseline. And yet you're projecting both higher deficits and slower economic growth. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. If we could just go to this chart, which is something CBO handed out. I think it's should be in everybody's packet. It's your one-pager. Because it points out the different components that make up the difference between your extended baseline scenario and the extended alternative fiscal scenario. And what I found interesting in this is that in this comparison that you did, there's actually very little difference in the major drivers of spending. In other words, if you look at Social Security and health care spending, under Scenario 1 and Scenario 2, it's only 0.7% of GDP difference in the year 2037, even when you go way out there. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And if you look at the all other federal spending, as I understand it, one of the big components of that is that you assume that we will not allow the sequester to go into effect, nor will we replace the sequester with an equivalent amount of deficit reduction. Am I correct about your assumption there?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So if you actually look at these drivers, that component, assuming that we will not replace the sequester, and the gap in total revenues, plus the interest payments, which result mostly in this analysis from increased debt as a result of less revenue, are the major reasons for the difference between your extended alternative scenario and extended baseline scenario. Is that correct?
I think that's right, Congressman. I mean, once the debt starts to grow relative to GDP, it continues on that path, then interest payments start to pick up in the same way, and it snowballs in a very damaging way for the economy.
Right. And in this chart, the major difference, I mean, the number one driver, the top driver here is the difference in revenues, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And so I want to make it clear, I'm not proposing that we adopt the revenue policies underlying the extended baseline scenario, but I do think this chart, as well as the one I put up on the screen, argue very strongly for taking the kind of balanced approach that has been recommended by groups like Simpson-Bowles, bipartisan groups. Let me just ask you a question about the debt ceiling, which by most forecasts we will hit possibly at the end of this year. What would be the economic consequences if the United States did not raise the debt ceiling?
We think that a default on American debt would be a devastating blow to the economy and the financial system. It's hard to know. We haven't done it. So we can't look to historical parallels in this country, really, in the modern era. But if a default were to occur in a sustained way, I mean, if the obligations that we've taken on really weren't honored, that would be a shock to a financial system that is already, in this country and particularly overseas, in a fragile state. And I don't know anybody who thinks we ought to let that happen. I realize there are disagreements among members of Congress about what else, if anything, should go along with an increase in the debt ceiling. I don't know anybody who thinks it would be useful to actually go ahead and default on that debt.
No, I think that's right, but I do think it's grossly irresponsible for anybody to threaten that the United States will not meet its obligations unless we enact somebody else's version of how to best reduce the budget. For example, the Speaker has said that he would object to raising the debt ceiling unless we reduce the deficit the way the Speaker wants to do it. If I could just ask you, Dr. Elmendorf, have you had a chance to look at the House Republican budget?
We don't analyze budget resolutions at CBO, Congressman. We have looked, as you know, at the chairman's own long-term budget proposal, and we released our analysis of that in March. But we've not looked at the budget resolution itself.
And do you know that the House Republican budget would require, even if you adopted all their provisions, would still require approximately a $5.2 trillion increase in the debt ceiling between now and 2022?
I'm not aware of that either way, Congressman. We have not studied that.
Well, if you could just get back to us to confirm that fact.
Let me just do it for you.
All right.
Debt will go up in this country under any budget scenario by the factors we're talking about here.
Right.
Demographics,
I just thought it was important to point out that despite the fact that the Speaker has made a big thing about using the debt ceiling to achieve his political purposes, that the Republican budget that he supports would require a $5.2 trillion increase in the debt ceiling.
And I introduced the Speaker's comments to the record last week to just make sure his comments are accurately reflected. With that, okay, Doug, turn your mic on, or pull it closer to you. I guess the sound people are not quite capturing
It is on, but I can.
Okay, yeah, a little closer to you then.
Lean closer.
Right up front. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Elmendorf. Just in referring to something the ranking member mentioned about tax rates or tax revenues as a percent of GDP, in 2007, I believe, under the current tax rates, revenues were 18.5% of GDP, and they are down now under the same tax rate. So my question or point of this is that the amount of revenue as a percent of GDP is affected not just by rates but by economic conditions.
Absolutely, Congressman.
Okay, so if we had a better economy today, you would have a larger share of revenue even under the existing tax rates.
Yes.
And 18.5% is fairly close to the historic average since World War II, is it not?
Well, when CBO talks about averages, we generally use the last 40 years.
Okay.
In the last 40 years, revenues have averaged 17.9% of GDP.
Right. So under the existing tax rates in a good economy in 2007, we actually had a larger revenues as a share of the economy were actually larger than the average over the previous 40 years.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Next question, relative to what we charitably call Obamacare, and on the other side they call the Affordable Care Act. Does all of your scenarios, I believe, both the alternative scenario and the baseline scenario, include Obamacare and that law being in effect? Is that correct?
So we use the term Affordable Care Act ourselves, Congressman.
I'm sure you do.
As I think a lot of independent analysts do. Under both the scenarios, most of the Affordable Care Act is included. There's one point a little different. In the extended alternative fiscal scenario, we turn off a couple of the provisions that would reduce the growth of health care spending in what was the second decade when the Affordable Care Act was enacted. In particular, we don't allow the continued reductions in the growth of payments to Medicare providers to go on, and we turn off some of the extra indexing of the thresholds for different size subsidies through the insurance exchanges. So we take away a few of the features that would create greater slowdown in federal costs in the second decade.
Why did you turn those off in your alternative scenario?
So as we defined in the scenario, we view it as extending some policies that have been in place for a long time, but also as modifying some policies that we think would be difficult to sustain for a long period of time. And the cutbacks in payments to Medicare providers are sort of incremental. Every year is a lower growth rate.
Okay,
and as the years go on, we think it becomes harder and harder.
So you basically think they kind of wouldn't work, so you take them back.
We think it would be more difficult, and we're trying to offer you an alternative perspective.
Okay. And then under either of these scenarios then, total outlays of the health programs Medicare, Medicaid, and the SCHIP program would rise 78%, I have under the baseline scenario, and 93% over the next 25 years as a share of GDP. So the medical costs would rise, medical entitlements would rise by 78% as a percent of GDP under the baseline and 93% under the alternative scenario. Those figures sound correct?
Yes, they sound right.
Those are the biggest drivers of expense increases in the budget by far, are they not?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then in a letter to Chairman Ryan, you were asked, CBO was asked, what would tax increases would be necessary if you were going to pay for all this entirely with tax increases. and you concluded that you would need a 33% across-the-board rate hike by 2023, 48% by 2030, and an 86% increase in all tax rates by 2050 in order to just keep a balanced budget under the alternative fiscal scenario going out.
So you quote those numbers correctly, Congressman. I want to be clear what the experiment was. The experiment we were asked to look at was a case where the increase in tax revenue came entirely through increases in tax rates.
Right. No.
Of course, a whole other approach to
I understand.
the tax code that would involve broadening the tax base that, of course, is being discussed.
No, I understand. I have lots more to say, but only 25 seconds to say it. So all I merely wanted to point out from this is that you have these huge medical entitlement cost drivers. You can't do an 86% increase in taxes. We have to deal with these things, and we have to deal with them quickly. We don't want to have to make the rapid changes that Europe did. Europe's problems are because they let their European socialism that they weren't paying for go on too long, so that they had to try and fix it too quickly. We need to get on this right away so we have a slower glide path to correcting these problems. Thank you.
Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. As I read page 4 of your summary, and just paraphrasing it, to keep deficits and debt from climbing to unsustainable levels, policymakers will need to increase revenues substantially, decrease spending significantly, or adopt some combination of these two approaches. And that's basically what your testimony has been this morning.
Yes, exactly, Congressman.
And thus far, the Congress over the last year has pursued the reducing spending significantly only. I believe that under the agreement that was reached last year, if fully implemented, spending would be reduced by about $2 trillion. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right, Congressman.
No revenue increase at all, an entirely one-sided approach to addressing this problem.
The Budget Control Act focused on spending cuts, exactly.
And your testimony this morning is that if we continue to pursue that course of only cutting spending with no additional revenues, we will have to substantially reduce Medicare and Social Security, will we not?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And each time that the Congress passes another tax cut without paying for any of it, $46 billion in a recent week for a business tax cut, $29 billion this week for a medical device tax directed mostly at trying to weaken the Affordable Health Care Act, but still $29 billion a year tends to add up. Each time they pass one of these tax cuts without paying for it, that adds to the debt and would increase the amount of spending that would have to be cut, directly impacting Medicare and Social Security, doesn't it?
Yes, any increase in spending or reduction in taxes that isn't offset, that isn't paid for through some other policy change, is going to push our debt above this trajectory we have under current law. And as I said, under current law, that only very gradually declines relative to GDP, and even a quarter century from now would be exceptionally large by U.S. historical standards.
And your testimony this morning is that if we extend the Bush tax cuts and make the adjustments with the AMT associated with those and don't pay for them, that's $4.5 trillion in additional debt.
Yes, plus the debt service.
Plus the debt service, which will add a significant amount.
Yes.
So though Congress has taken an approach of cutting spending by $2 trillion, one of the alternatives being advanced for approval in the House this summer is that we have unpaid for $4.5 trillion of less revenue. And the impact will be to significantly increase the debt if that were to become law, and to make it nearly certain that we would have to make substantial cuts in Social Security and Medicare unless we wanted to have uncontrollable debt.
If those tax cuts were extended and no other changes were made to fiscal policy, that would make the federal budget outlook significantly worse in the medium run and long run, and it would worsen the economic outlook in the medium run and long run.
Yes. My concern is that those who continue to preach what may be a good rhetoric at a political convention, that Washington doesn't have a tax problem and only has a spending problem, ignores the fact that we really have a little of both. And that unless we have a balanced approach to trying to get our budget in balance, we ensure that Medicare and Social Security, as generations of Americans have known them, will not be there for them, and that is, I think, a terrible and unjustified cost to pay. As far as the spending side, because we do have to focus on both, you've talked about the fact that we don't just have a Medicare health problem or a veterans health problem or a children's health insurance health cost problem. We have a health cost problem generally. And one of those areas that some folks have suggested might help us resolve that is to copy the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. From looking at that program, has it produced substantial savings that would help us avoid these problems?
CBO's written about this before, Congressman, and I'm not completely familiar with it, but I believe our conclusion was that premium increases in the federal employees program have been roughly comparable to increases elsewhere in the health care system. And we show in our long-term outlook comparative rates of cost growth, Medicare, Medicaid, and in the rest of the health care system. There are different periods of time when certain pieces have outpaced other pieces. But we see in general, as you commented, across the board increases in health care costs that have outpaced the growth in GDP. And that's what creates this increasing bind for the federal budget and for state and local government budgets and for the budgets of firms and households.
Thank you.
And finally, the experience then with the federal health program shows it's no panacea to solve this rising health care cost problem.
Time for the gentleman's expired. Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome again, Dr. Elmendorf, to the committee. I appreciate the long-term projections that you've made. I want to talk about a couple different items. First, the debt ceiling. Our friends on the other side oftentimes use the language that people are threatening to have the United States not meet its obligations. You're not aware of anybody that's threatening to have the United States not meet its obligations, are you?
Just to speak.
Congressman, as you know, I try not to characterize the comments of members of Congress. I said, and I repeat, I don't know anybody who thinks we actually should default. I recognize there's a disagreement about what other policies, if any, should be combined with an increase in the debt ceiling.
I think that's fair. If we're talking about the debt ceiling, and if a debt ceiling increase is required, and the options are to have no spending reduction and a debt ceiling increase, or a debt ceiling increase and accompanied with a spending reduction, which has a more positive effect on economic activity and output?
Well, in the short term, Congressman, we think, as do most economists, that a cutback in government spending will weaken the economy, will lower output and employment. Over the longer term, if the reduction in government spending is not accompanied by other changes and thus leads to a reduction in the debt, then that would be good for the economy.
So a decrease in the debt, as you mentioned before, lower debt results in more economic activity, more economic output.
Yes, that's right.
And a reduction in taxes, as you said earlier, lower taxes results in more economic output and more economic activity.
Lower marginal tax rates in particular. As you know, the many features of the tax code that affect the economy.
Yes.
But the lower tax rates on the margin can help encourage additional work and saving, and that's good for the economy.
Exactly, and that's what we've attempted to include within our budgets. I want to talk about the economic variables that you used in this long-term forecast. And it's my understanding that the average annual economic growth rate that you utilize for the next 5 years is 3.1%.
For the next 5 years, maybe, Congressman, I don't know that number.
I think that's accurate. And during the same time frame, you also forecast that the unemployment rate goes from its current rate to 5.5% by 2018.
Yes, that's correct.
And yet last week, your office warned that if the current law stays in place and $500 billion in tax increases go into effect in 2013 as scheduled, that the United States will likely go into a recession for a period of time next year.
Yes, that's right.
So is it safe to say that a recession would contract, decrease federal tax receipts similar to the levels that we saw in 07, 09?
It would certainly contract them. That was a very severe recession that brought revenues as low as they were a few years ago. We don't think they'd fall as low again. because we'd be predicting a mild recession. But
So-
certainly the direction is the same, Congressman.
So if the Congress doesn't act and the current law is realized, would you expand on your perspective on how this will impact the macroeconomy in terms of employment and economic growth?
Yes, we think that if the Congress allows current law to unfold through the end of the year and into next year, that the economy will contract in the first half of next year and will grow only slightly over next year as a whole, and that employment will be a good deal lower and unemployment higher than would be the case if the federal budget weren't contracting in that way. As one goes later in the decade and beyond, then the path of smaller deficits would be good for the economy and would strengthen output and incomes. That's what the extended baseline scenario shows here over time relative to the extended alternative fiscal scenario.
So the proposals that we have attempted to put forward, which are either keeping marginal rates as they are, not increasing marginal rates on individuals, and decreasing spending at the federal level, decreasing debt, the slope of the debt, would be a positive factor from an economic output, economic standpoint.
Yes, the lower tax rates and lower debt are both good for the economy in the long run.
In my short time remaining, would you care to address the difference between tax rates, marginal rates, and revenue to the federal government? Because our friends oftentimes confuse those two or use those synonymously.
So in simple terms, the revenue the government collects equal the tax rates times the tax base to which those rates are applied. And our current tax base, we talk about the income tax as if it were tax on all income at the individual or corporate levels. In fact, our tax bases are a lot narrower than overall individual income or overall corporate income. And thus, given the set of tax rates that we have in place, we collect less revenue than we would if the bases were broader. Raising tax revenue by raising tax rates will tend to hurt the economy. Raising tax revenue by broadening the base could help or hurt the economy depending on the nature of the changes. So some of the features, some of the special deductions and credits and so on, are bad for the economy because they distort individuals' behaviors. They encourage certain things at the expense of other things in a way that is not consistent with the market price signals and perhaps not consistent with our social aims. On the other hand, there are features, credits and deductions and so on, that may be helpful in offsetting distortions that exist in the private markets or that do help to achieve social gains. So it's very hard to make any broad statements about whether broadening the tax base would be good or bad for the economy. For particular sorts of changes, we have the modeling capacity, and our colleagues on the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation have the modeling capacity to provide estimates to you and your colleagues about the economic effects. But it's hard to make general statements about the effects of broadening the tax base.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you. Doctor, we appreciate your patience in coming back again and carefully trying to parse your words to be accurate and resist our efforts to use portions of them to justify our heartfelt needs and soundbite
I appreciate
quota.
you understanding my predicament, Congressman.
And I continue to marvel how well you do it. I loved how you used earlier the term all things being equal. Because this is the thrust of your analysis, is to let us know what's going to happen, all things being equal. I loved what you said a moment ago in terms of how you structured the tax provisions, because there can be some that can reinforce productive activity, some can distort economic activity. That could be the case, for example, for lavish agricultural subsidies, couldn't it? If these are borrowed dollars that distort the marketplace, that encourage overproduction of something that may even have environmental damaging impacts, and shortchange things like nutrition support, which, like food stamps, actually helps sustain the economy. This is one of the things CBO has ruled as a powerful stimulant. So, for example, all things being equal, if we got our agricultural subsidies refined, that might be something that could save money and improve productivity, couldn't it?
It might be, Congressman. We have not studied the
And I'm not asking you to
effects of
walk,
agricultural
I'm not asking you to walk that plank now. I just want you to help me with the hypothetical. Done right, we could reduce the deficit, improve productivity, and move forward.
Potentially so, yes, Congressman.
Likewise, were we to deal meaningfully with reforming our military spending, some things like hundreds of billions of dollars maintaining a nuclear arsenal that we're not going to use, hopefully, ever, has less economic impact than lowering the deficit, reducing potentially taxes, or investing in things like education and infrastructure. Isn't it possible that getting that right could boost our economy while reducing the deficit? Isn't it possible?
There are a whole variety of possible changes, Congressman, in federal programs that might be good.
But maintaining a nuclear arsenal doesn't have a ripple effect, doesn't strengthen other parts of the economy. I mean, this is more of a drag on the economy than investing in education, bridges, or sewer systems, is it not?
Well, in general, Congressman, we think that when the federal government spends money, that in the short term, there is a positive multiplier effect to other things. And if the federal government pays my salary, I go buy some things at the store, which helps
yes.
people.
And
the salary of somebody
I understand the principles, and I'm not trying to trap you. I just want to put on the table that there are some things that have less of a multiplier than investing in our future, all things being equal.
So, yes, in addition to the short-term economic effects, where we talk about multipliers in particular, different sorts of government spending could represent investments in our future, and others may be more for current consumption.
And I guess that's one of the things that, all things being equal, it would seem to me that if we were, in fact, investing, as we used to do in this country, on things like roads and bridges and transit, improving sewer and water and environmental protection, these investments actually put lots of people to work at family wage jobs, have economic benefits, and avoid costs in the future. Isn't that possible, all things being equal?
Yes, Congressman. We have written about the economics of additional investment in transportation and water infrastructure. We've noted, for example, that according to the Federal Highway Administration, there are a large number of highway projects that would have benefits that substantially exceed their costs. They're not currently being funded. And to fund all of that infrastructure investment would require a good deal more money from either the federal government or other sources.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate your patience with us. And I guess that's the note I would conclude on, because there are lots of things that people on this committee, in their heart of hearts, could agree on, whether it's refining agricultural investment at a time when we have virtually zero interest rates, that we could finance long-term investments for infrastructure, could make a huge difference in all our communities. And I hope we reach the point, maybe the fiscal cliff helps us look at this in a more comprehensive and thoughtful fashion in ways that will make a long-term difference to our communities and our economy. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to have Mr. Van Hollen's chart put back up on the screens if we can. Okay. This chart I found to be interesting. There were two factors, I think, in play here that were not discussed. Number one is in 2001, where the chart starts, we had an exogenous factor come into play, and that's when the war on terror started, beginning with the attacks on 9/11. So I think that that particular fact was conveniently left out. And if you move over to 2007, we had a political change that occurred, and that was when the other party assumed control of Congress in both houses. And you can see the huge increases in spending that occurred, and also the impact on the economy with the changes in the regulatory environment. Dr. Elmendorf, when the stimulus bill was passed, it was widely believed that unemployment would go down because of that stimulus program. But here we are 3.5 years later, and we had a peak to 10% unemployment. We've had about 40 months of employment higher than 8%. The other side of the aisle is proposing to continue to have another round of stimulus. They've changed the name to investment. and saying that's going to be the panacea to solve our deficits and to solve our debt problem that we have in this country that you've done a great job of explaining. My question is this: can you explain in about 30 seconds or less why the stimulus didn't achieve its desired outcomes and what impact it's had on our debt and deficits?
So the economy has performed a good deal worse than we expected and many forecasters expected a few years ago. In our assessment, and the assessment of most economists, I think, the Recovery Act created more output and more employment than would have happened without it. But the underlying weakness of the economy, not unusual in comparison to other countries that have had financial crisis-induced recessions, but unusual for us, the other underlying weakness of the economy has more than offset the efforts of fiscal policymakers and monetary policymakers.
So that takes
the economy back on a strong course.
That takes us to the next question, and I've asked this question before. What is more efficient in terms of causing increasing economic activity? Is it public sector spending or private sector spending? I mean, in other words, it's a choice between a Solyndra expenditure or a Keystone expenditure. Which of those is better for the economy?
Well, we haven't studied those two particular types.
But they're the poster children, so let's talk about it because they're the poster.
In an economy where the constraint on output and employment is weak demand for goods and services, which is the economy that we've been living through for the past 4.5 years, then additional demand from the private sector or from the government will raise output, raise employment relative to what would otherwise occur.
And what causes that increased demand? What is it? I mean, under that thinking that public sector spending can raise demand, I mean, then you would have had a $4 trillion stimulus or a $5 trillion stimulus. But of course, the impact on the economy would have been tragic because of its impact on federal deficits and debt. So isn't it better to rely on private sector spending for economic stimulative activity? Well, wouldn't you want to do things that encourage private sector investment in jobs in our economy and paychecks than public sector spending?
Well, Congressman, we've been clear that the extra debt that was accumulated through the Recovery Act, if not offset by other policy changes later, will lead to an ongoing level of higher debt that will, in the medium term and long term, be a drag on the economy.
Correct. So we wouldn't want to.
Term, I think policymakers have tried to both stimulate private spending and to increase public spending.
So it would be inappropriate to double down in terms of a failed program to continue. If the stimulus version 1.0 worked, why would stimulus version 2.0 work any better?
But Congressman, as you understand, and I recognize you don't agree with us, but our position is that the Recovery Act was not a failed program. Our position is that it created higher output and employment than would have occurred without it. And we did analysis last fall in testimony to the Senate Budget Committee of a collection of alternative proposals, some tax increases, some tax cuts, some spending increases that we think would spur output and employment.
What would have had a higher impact? If you'd had $700 billion of additional GDP from the private sector versus $700 billion of GDP, or of spending from the public sector, which would have had greater impact on the economy?
Well, over the past few years, Congressman, that extra spending, wherever it came from, would have led to more jobs. And there's no reason to think that the extra spending in the private sector would lead to more additional jobs than extra spending in the public sector. Over a longer period of time, the question is what sorts of goods and services have been purchased. And if the public sector was investing, then that would be good. And if the private sector was investing, that would be good in the long run.
Thank you.
That was fast, Andy.
Reach a conclusion.
Time's getting here. I would just say to the gentleman from Texas, we had that hearing on multiplier effects, where there's clearly a difference of opinion on Keynesian multipliers, and maybe go back to that hearing. We had Mr. Zandy, who I think represented the CBO's position, and we had Mr. Taylor from Stanford, who represented an alternative position. That hearing probably kind of gives a little illustration on this point. Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for your testimony. The cost of health care is frequently mentioned as a significant factor in increased spending, and your testimony certainly reinforces that as well. And traditional approaches to addressing rising costs have included cutting people from care, cutting provider rates, cutting services. And in my state of Oregon, we've come together in order to take a new approach, particularly regarding the uninsured and our Medicaid dollars. And it was actually quite refreshing to see business, labor, Republicans, Democrats, educators all come together and work on this healthcare transformation that is with the goal of improving care while cutting costs. Integrating and coordinating services, including physical and mental and oral health care. The modeling that's taken place involves coordinating physical and behavioral health care, better preventing and managing chronic diseases, using patient-centered primary care homes, and improving and aligning care for individuals who are dual eligible. So the establishment of these coordinated care organizations is projected to actually improve care while reducing costs and increasing access. And in fact, by coordinating services, Oregon projects a 4.9 to 9.7% savings in the second year of implementation compared without the transformation to a 10% increase. And this savings is expected to build over time. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this type of change would impact the federal budget if a similar approach was implemented in other states as well.
Well, I think, Congresswoman, there are a tremendous amount of experimentation going on in different states and different private providers of care and private insurers in an effort to get more value for our health care dollars. And I think the ferment of experimentation is a very positive factor. But it's also true that a number of experiments that have been tried over the years have not worked as well as advocates hoped. And even those that have worked have proven in some cases more difficult to expand across different provider settings, across different states' healthcare systems. We did a long and careful review of a collection of Medicare demonstration projects in both value-based payment methods and disease management and care coordination. And these were Medicare demonstrations. We wrote about this last year. And the set of demonstrations that Medicare has tried have found that when there's a direct interaction between a care manager and physicians, and then in-person interaction with patients, where there really is a lot of effort, a lot of energy being focused on this care coordination, that sort of model was more likely to reduce spending, gross spending, but it also had its own costs in terms of paying for these interactions. So in Medicare, there's not yet been a model that's been used in any widespread way that has had the effects people are looking for of higher quality care and lower costs at the same time. It doesn't mean it can't happen. Probably it can happen, but people are still trying to figure out just how to do it, and just how to do it, as I said, in different sorts of settings.
Right.
So the Affordable Care Act introduces a lot of different programs, a lot of different, particularly the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, as you know, that's designed to do more experiments faster, to reach conclusions more rapidly, and then to be able to extend the successful programs across the system more rapidly. And we think that will have some positive effects, but how large those effects will be and just what arrangements will turn out to be most effective, we don't know yet.
Well, thank you for your testimony, and I know that we'll all be watching what's happening in my home state as well as those other states, because until we can increase access and start addressing the high costs of chronic care, we're going to be increasing those costs, and we need to be keeping people out of emergency rooms. So I appreciate your testimony, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Langford.
Thank you. Thank you as well for being here. Let me talk a little bit about page 35 of your report. You have an interesting section of something I've talked a lot about as well, and that is the effect of government borrowing and what effect that really has on the economy as a whole. And just this top paragraph in the right-hand column there, increased government borrowing generally draws money away from or crowds out private investment in productive capital, leading to a smaller stock of capital and lower output in the long run that would otherwise be the case. Deficits generally have that effect on private investment because the portion of people's savings used to buy government securities is not available to finance private investment. The description that you made there, I've talked about before, and I know you've spoken about often as well, and that is this effect that the more that we borrow, the more that we require of capital that would otherwise be invested into productive things rather than just sovereign debt. That is occurring worldwide currently. This trend, as you see, and I'm going to ask you, I don't know this in the center of your of something you want to talk about or not, but we've got that issue happening in Europe, other parts of the world, as well as here. What do you think that effect is currently of the crowding out of investment worldwide based on sovereign debt?
Well, the countries in Europe have a collection of overlapping problems, as you know.
Right.
They have a banking crisis, they have a fiscal crisis, they have a growth crisis. And as we wrote in an issue brief a few years ago about the risk of a fiscal crisis in the United States, once one ends up in that situation, then there are no good options. Countries that are unable to borrow at affordable rates feel the need to cut back on their borrowing. At the same time, that cutting back on spending or increase in revenues tends to slow the economy, which then worsens their budget situation. And it really is a vicious circle. We think the European economic situation is weighing on the U.S. economy now and has the potential to be a much more significant negative force if they don't find a way to keep their system going.
But it also is a benefit to us in that it keeps our interest rates low because people don't invest in their sovereign debt, they invest in ours. And so it's this double-edged sword that, yes, it's slowing down our economy, but yes, it's actually helping us in keeping our interest rates low on our debt.
Yes, it's pushing down Treasury interest rates because people are engaged in this flight to relative safety. But it's probably weighing on the other parts of our financial system. And that's, I think, where the biggest risk lies. If they have a larger collapse in their financial system, their potential of very large negative spillovers to ours.
Right. You've mentioned often as well about tax rates and marginal rates and such, and that a lower marginal rate tends to increase productivity or at least activity in the economy. In that, can you factor in certainty and uncertainty? In the last several years as well, there's been this constant, we don't know what the rate is going to be next year mentality that has happened, and rates seem to be tweaked out every single year. Can you factor in the difference between certainty and uncertainty in marginal rates?
It's very difficult to quantify. We think that the uncertainty about federal policies on a whole variety of areas, including the tax code, is weighing on the economy. It's a negative factor in current economic
activity. As we walk through this year,
how large a factor is very hard to know.
As we walk through this year, once we get to the end of the year, there's common discussion about all this expiration of all these tax rates from 2001 and 2003. Better to resolve those earlier or better to resolve those later? We've got about 6 months to do either of those, so it's not exactly early even at this point.
Earlier is better, no doubt.
Okay. Do you think it's possible to address our national debt burden or deficits at all without dealing with the major entitlement programs?
Well, Congressman, as I said at the beginning, it is possible to maintain Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as they are under current law, but only by substantially raising taxes on a broad group of Americans. And similarly, it is possible to maintain taxes at their historical average share of GDP, but only by making substantial cuts relative to current law in the large entitlement programs that benefit a broad section of Americans at some point in their lives. That's what makes this choice that you and your colleagues face and that we as American citizens face so difficult. One can pick to hold one part of the budget as it would otherwise be, but given the gap between revenues and spending under current policies, then one has to make even larger, even more dramatic changes in the other part of the budget. And you can see that in our extended baseline scenario here, what happens under current law, which is a very large increase in tax revenue. And one can see an alternative vision in Chairman Ryan's long-term proposal that we analyzed in March, which holds revenues down, but makes very large cuts in a number of federal programs.
Either way, earlier is better to resolve this.
But certainly for those longer-term issues as well, earlier is much better because it gives people time to plan and adjust. It gives you a chance to phase in changes gradually and yet have them take effect in a way that's important in dollar terms before the debt gets even larger than it is today.
That'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Elmendorf, it's interesting, we talk about cuts in entitlement programs a lot, but I'd like to talk about another program and in your assumptions on that, in your two scenarios. What were your assumptions for defense spending as a percentage of GDP?
Defense spending?
Defense spending.
So what we do for our long-term scenarios is we just take the set of all programs apart from...
I understand. I just have a few minutes. If you could just tell me what it is.
We don't have an explicit projection for defense spending
You don't. Okay.
beyond the 10-year budget window. In the window, we have the specific baseline projection.
And that is?
And that I'm not sure I...
Well, so then you'll have to look for that. So maybe you can get back to us if you can answer this question. Mr. Romney, who's the Republican nominee for president soon-to-be, has proposed to never allow defense spending to go below 4% of GDP. What would be the impact of such a sustained, elevated level of spending over the remainder of the decade? And that is, he just said never go below. He didn't say anything. He didn't put any qualifiers for a global security environment. What would that have on the effect of domestic discretionary spending under your two scenarios?
Well, so in our baseline, Congresswoman, this all other category is only 7.3% of GDP in 2022. So if defense spending were 4% of GDP, that would leave just a little over 3% of GDP for all of the domestic programs apart from this handful of large entitlement programs. And that would be a dramatic reduction relative to their historical average.
So there's a plan on the table for Mr. Romney, and I mentioned his decision never to allow defense spending to go below 4% of GDP. He also talks about cutting revenues of $6 trillion over the decade by making the Bush tax cuts permanent, cutting the corporate rate from 35% to 25%, eliminating the estate tax, capital gains tax, taxes on dividend earnings, along with other tax breaks. So when you add the increase to defense spending, what would be the impact on the deficit with all the other cuts to revenue that he's talking about having? And what effect would it have on the safety net and entitlements?
Congresswoman, I'm sorry. We've not analyzed Mr. Romney's plan, nor do we ever analyze the plans of candidates for office. So
well, you
I
have
can't
two
speak
scenarios.
to the collection of things that he particularly
Okay, but you have two scenarios. One in which you have the tax cuts not happening, the sequestration happening. Mr. Romney's talking about undoing that and then increasing defense spending. I mean, what would be the effect on the safety net and the entitlement program? Because you do have one scenario in which the Bush tax cuts expire, the corporate rate doesn't change. He's talking about undoing that.
Right. So if you extend all the tax policies that are expiring, as we do in our alternative scenario, but then that by itself would put debt on this steep upward trajectory. If one then wants to maintain the slight downward trajectory of debt under current law, then one needs to cut other parts of the government by trillions of dollars.
So it would be that scenario plus more, if any,
yes,
for dispense, which would even mean
and if one increased defense spending relative to what's in current law, then that would require, and still wanted to keep debt on a downward trajectory, then one would have to make comparably larger cutbacks in other domestic programs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stutzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here. I always enjoy your analysis and your testimony. I'd like to talk about interest rates and then segue that into taxes. On page 32, one of your points under interest rates says, an increase in government debt tends to raise interest rates by leading people to allocate a larger portion of their savings to the purchase of government securities, such as treasury bonds, and thereby crowding out investment in productive capital goods, such as factories and computers. Can you talk a little bit about, or does your report here touch on why are interest rates at record low levels right now?
We don't talk about that here, Congressman. We will in our August regular forecast update. The principal factors seem to be weak economy and thus weak private credit demands and a flight to relative safety from financial markets, particularly in Europe, that are in a especially fragile state right now.
Would QE1, QE2, is that going to be, that's obviously playing a part of that. If that expires, are we going to see interest rates increasing in the near future?
Well, so certainly for short-run rates, that's important. I was more focused on the longer-run rates. And the actions the Federal Reserve have brought down longer-term rates. But if one looks at financial markets out beyond the next few years, out, say, later in the decade, they're expecting a noticeable increase in interest rates, short-term and long-term interest rates. And our economic forecast has included in it noticeable increases in short-term and long-term interest rates. For later in the decade, we're looking for a short-term rate close to 4% and a 10-year rate of about 5%, and that's roughly consistent with readings in financial markets.
Okay, and then on page 43, under the bullet point of the need for higher taxes or less spending on government programs, am I correct from what you had stated earlier? You talked about rates versus base, because there's a lot of rhetoric here in Washington that Republicans are against revenue increases when, in fact, in our own budget, we address the tax policy and suggest that we go to two tax rates, at 10% and a 25% tax rate. Am I clear? Is it clear that you're discussing one scenario versus the other, where there's a tax rate increase, which you are discouraging with the expiration of the tax rates, or in your alternative scenario, a broadening of the base? Do you discuss any of those in the report?
No, we don't. I mean, we're not trying here particularly to explore the details of alternative tax policies. I mean, current law would have a certain set of things occur, which we try to capture in the extended baseline scenario. And then the alternative scenario tries to capture the extension of a variety of expiring provisions. So it turns out that under this alternative scenario, given the provisions, if one extends the expiring provisions, that marginal tax rates are kept low, and the base is not changed, really. It also turns out that under current law, there's some effective broadening of the base, because more and more income would be taxed under the alternative minimum tax, which just has a broader base than the regular individual income.
So broadening the base would not hurt the economy as the way that raising the rates, current rates, would affect the economy. Is that correct?
I think that's generally true, but again, the effects of broadening the base depends a lot on just the nature of the broadening, and particular provisions that might be broadened in, say, a tax reform plan that Congress considered. We'd have to look at those specific provisions, and we're prepared to do that and talk with you about the economic effects of those.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll leave it back.
Thank you, Ms. Schwartz. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, Ms. Castor. My apologies. Ms. Castor, you were here first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here today. If we had more people working across America, would our debt and deficit situation be improved?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell us if we had if the unemployment rate was 1% lower, how much better our debt and deficit situation would be? Or 2%?
I did not bring that magic table. This is now the second time I wish I had. We wrote a letter to Congressman Van Hollen a few months ago that talked about the effects on the economy effects on the budget if the economy were stronger. I think we said that about a third of the current deficit would go away if the economy were somehow immediately put back close to full employment.
That's right.
See, that's one of the frustrations, because there is absolutely no dialogue from my friends on the other side of the aisle as job creation is part of debt reduction and deficit reduction. We could really give a boost to this improving economy if we could do some things on jobs. I mean, here are the positive signs. We've had 27 straight months of private sector job growth. Manufacturing employment continues to trend upwards. Consumer confidence is up. The median home price, the sales figures are up. If you look, corporate profits are up. So things are trending in the right direction, and here the Congress could be really helpful in job creation and in deficit reduction if we could come together to do some things on jobs. But unfortunately, My friends on the other side of the aisle blocked the jobs plan put forth last year that said, let's rebuild schools across America. That would put a lot of people in construction back to work and leave us with better facilities for students. They have stalled the transportation bill. I mean, look at this transportation bill. When do you have 75 votes out of the United States Senate on a bipartisan bill? And yet that has been stalled for months and months and months. And I heard your earlier comment on when it comes to infrastructure. You said oftentimes the benefits outseed the costs. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. It depends a lot on the specific project, but there are a lot of projects that aren't being done in highways, for example, where the benefits to the economy would be a lot greater than the costs.
And then when you factor in the Republican budget that was passed, that's a prescription for disaster when it comes to the future plans for this country, because they so slash the important investments that government and the private sector work on together, whether it's in scientific research or it's in infrastructure, in education. And I think their one-sided, unbalanced approach is really going to cause great damage. I think it's causing damage now because we could come together now to take a good whack at the debt and deficit if we could do some things on jobs. So I'm hopeful there's still time to do it, but I hear your message loud and clear sooner rather than later. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elmendorf, I always appreciate your reports. I do read those and highlight them and learn so much by them, so thank you for your work. I wasn't going to go in this direction, but I just have to address what the gentlelady from Florida was talking about, that there are ways to raise revenues. One is to tax people more, and the other is to have those that are employed paying those taxes, which then raises revenue. And I can't let this go by to say that as I'm visiting with my job creators in my community, that what they tell me is there's so much uncertainty out there, this is why they're not growing, that the uncertainty really creates paralysis. And so getting them some certainty and certainly looking at what you're saying on the budget outlook and helping us to understand where the debt drivers are, help us to make those decisions on policies. But we got 30 pro-job creator bills laying there that have not been handled by the Senate. So let me just go to the area, though. When we look at those areas that are driving our debt and the long-term debt of our country, what would you say those significant drivers are?
Well, the feature of the budget that is becoming much different than it was in the past is spending on the health care programs and to some extent spending on Social Security because of the rising cost of health care and the aging of the population.
So those two drivers that are most significant that we continue to hear about in the budget forecast that you give to us in other ways are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Would you say those are the biggest drivers?
Those are the big changes.
Okay.
Now, what you decide to do in response to those is of course, up to you.
If we could bring up the first chart that is taken from the CBO report but put into a chart that's, I think, easy to take a look at, we see historical average versus what the, if no changes in any of these programs, what will happen under the current law. So we see what has been the historic level of spending on these two areas, Mr. Elmendorf. Do you agree with what's up here on this?
Can't check the exact numbers,
okay,
but you certainly capture the gist of the point, Congresswoman, which is that Social Security and health care spending are on track to be much larger shares of the economy than they are today, and they're on a larger share today than they were over the past several decades.
So if we just take a look at really these two categories, we see they represent about a quarter, about 25% of GDP, and then if we look at it historically and where it will go, we're going to go up to 60. So we see here our total revenues. There's not a whole lot of room left for anything else in the budget. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Now, I should say, in that picture, I think, Congresswoman, the 2037 under current law, you've actually set revenues just above 18% of GDP. So to be clear, that is actually under our extended alternative fiscal scenario. Under current law, revenues rise a good deal more. So I think what you've done here is to extrapolate what we might think of as current policies and hold revenues at that, at that share of GDP. And certainly if revenues are held at that share of GDP that they've been historically, then the dramatic rise in costs for other programs makes the budget completely untenable, and that's why ultimately you and your colleagues face this choice of pushing that left bar down or that right bar up.
And so I think we just have to admit we can't stay where we are. There have got to be policy
absolutely.
changes. So if we can go to the next chart, and I think this is even more devastating if we look at current policy and we don't do anything. We keep sticking our head in the sand and saying, oh, we'll just wait, we'll wait. We see here that by 2037, our total spending far, far outpaces our total revenues, and we see how our debt continues to grow. And I think that these charts, as we put these out there for people to see, rather than these reports that are so instructive, and if we have time to read these, that's great, but when we just take a flash and we take a look at these in a chart form, it has got to wake us up to say there's got to be some changes as we move forward into the future.
That's absolutely right, Congresswoman. We cannot go back to the combination of policies in the past. I would just note about this chart again, so people are clear, this undercurrent law is actually under the alternative scenario. Moreover, total spending is that high in large part because of an explosion of interest payments, reflecting the gap between the non-interest spending and revenues over all the years between now and 2037. Non-interest spending would itself be a good deal higher in 2037 than it's been historically, but not as much higher than our historical average as shown in this picture.
So, I mean, you can take a lot of these scenarios and do different things with these charts, but I think that the most important thing is that when we take a look at it in a chart form such as this, it has got to be just striking to us that we've got to act on this. And we do have some alternatives out there, and hopefully we'll get serious and get out of the politics and get down to the policy and address these and get it done for the American people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And now, last but not least, Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate your testimony and your patience. I wanted to follow up. Actually, it was good to follow Ms. Black. Her charts could be. I was really interested in your answer, response on her charts, because you've just spent just about 2 hours telling us that it's not just spending; it's also revenue. And that last chart really ignores the fact that we could do something about revenue. I was surprised that you didn't say that, yes, it's not just spending, because you have just said it many times, that the problem we're facing in terms of deficits and the dramatic increases in deficits and the national debt relate to both spending and reductions in revenue. Can you just, that's true.
Yes, the unsustainability of fiscal policy is the gap between spending and revenues.
Right.
And whether you and your colleagues choose the gap under current policies, and whether you choose to resolve that by raising tax revenue or cutting spending is a choice that you can make, and we'll tell you.
And that last chart that was just shown is based on the fact that there will continue to be the lower revenues built on the fact that there is an insistence on the Republican side that instead of looking at both spending and revenues and recognizing that we cannot, given the dramatic concerns about a deficit, we cannot ignore the revenue side. Now, again, you've pointed out how we do that is for us to decide, but whether we maintain those tax deductions for our largest corporations, whether we can afford to do that, is completely ignored by that chart. And I just want to have you make absolutely clear that that is a choice the Republicans are making, to only look at the spending side and to refuse to look at the revenue side. And in fact, reduced revenues that they want to continue, they're making a choice to continue reduced revenues, refusing to raise any revenues. They've said only discussion about tax policy is if it's revenue neutral, no new revenues, even if those tax deductions are not contributing to economic growth, even if they don't do anything.
Will generally yield?
No. Would you answer that? I mean, would you just speak to that?
You're certainly right, Congresswoman, that the explosion of debt and explosion of interest payments that we show under the extended alternative fiscal scenario could be addressed either by reductions in spending relative to that scenario or increases in revenues.
Or a combination.
Or through a combination.
And one of the things that we have put forward, and I contend this all the time, that budgets are about choices. We have put forward, the Democrats have put forward a budget that is clear about our insistence that, yes, we're going to deal with the deficit, we're going to create that certainty, we're going to do it in a way that does not hurt our fragile economic recovery. We've seen economic growth, but we want to see more. And the only way we're going to do it, and every bipartisan commission has said, it's got to be both looking at the revenue side, getting rid of tax deductions that do not grow the economy, in spite of the other side saying they're job creators. They have not created jobs. The provisions that don't create jobs, that don't create economic growth, that we could get rid of those, that we could increase, see something on the side of revenues. But of course we're going to cut spending. We have already. We've made that commitment. $1 trillion this year, $1 trillion plus at the end of this year in tough ways. So could you just be... This is really about choices that we're making, and it is about choices of whether we take all of it out of the spending side, that we walk away from our commitment to our seniors on Medicare, which is, of course, the Republicans have voted for time and time again, that we walk away from investments in education and innovation and growth industries, and yes, as was pointed out on our side, walk away from the potential of public investments now, such as in transportation and infrastructure, that not only grow jobs right now, but actually help economic growth in the private sector by creating demand and creating an environment that grows jobs and encourages companies to stay here, invest here, and grow jobs in the private sector. It is certainly possible, and your testimony for the last 2 hours have suggested we've got to take the approach of a balanced approach, and we've got to do it sooner than later.
As you know, Congresswoman, I can't tell you what approach you should take, but you're absolutely right that you and your colleagues and we as citizens face fundamental choices about the role of the government in our society, what we want to do collectively versus what we want to do privately. And the choices are forced upon us because we have a set of programs that are becoming much more expensive than they used to be.
And reduced revenues.
And
reduced revenues that...
Everything else has to adjust.
Thank you. Mr. Hewlett-Camp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, I appreciate you being here. I had a couple follow-up questions on earlier discussion, I think, from one of my colleagues in reference to the stimulus package and why it didn't work, and you had some comments, but I want to refresh your memory. The administration, and I presume the CBO, had predicted the same outcome or similar outcome, predicted that roughly the unemployment rate today would be 5.7% if that had worked. As the economist, most economists, I guess, in town that were promoting that, of course, today it's 8.2% is the actual unemployment rate. The delta, the difference is 13 million Americans are not working today that were projected. You said that the economic recession was worse than was figured. Well, can you tell me what numbers were missed? The reason I'm asking this is it's not a gotcha question. I'm trying to find out who in this town actually does an accurate job of predicting, because the folks that said we need to spend more money were very, very wrong. And can you tell me where you and others were wrong as far as the economic figures you were using for that type of projection?
Yes, Congressman, those are good questions. Economic forecasting is very hard. We release a regular update of our success at that, and I think the good way to phrase that, to summarize that, is that we're no worse than other economic forecasters. But I put it that way deliberately. It's very hard to do. I think in our case, and for many people, for many forecasters, the U.S. has not experienced a recession of the magnitude of the one we've just lived through since the Depression. We have become used to having infrequent and fairly mild recessions, and we and other forecasters expected this to be like that. In fact, people who have studied more carefully downturns in other countries following financial crises were saying from the beginning that in this sort of situation, we should be looking for a much longer and more pronounced downturn in this country, and they turn out to have been right. I want to be clear about this effects of the Recovery Act. There is disagreement, as the chairman noted, among economists about the size of these multipliers. And reflecting that disagreement, we show ranges of estimates. But there is only a small fraction of the profession that thinks that the Recovery Act was not good for the economy. There's a set of economists at the
and Doctor, I appreciate that. But on what particular figures? Just in general, you're saying that most economists were generally wrong, or were there specific indicators that were missed? Because, and this gets pretty political, because we have folks suggesting, and maybe yourself, that it wasn't big enough, that we should be spending more money. And actually, according to your report on page 34, you suggest that if we could just spend some more money somehow, that's going to grow the economy some more. And after spending $880 billion with a $1.1 trillion cost to pay it back, I just can't figure out what economic indicators were missed to suggest that we should have another stimulus or a bigger stimulus or just spend more money of any type that somehow that's going to grow the economy. What did you and other economists miss specifically that led to this huge jobs deficit between what was projected by the folks that produced the stimulus? I mean, we're talking 13 million Americans would like an answer to say, okay, where did Washington mess up? Because you're saying most economists think it should have worked. It didn't.
Would the gentleman yield for a second? So, would you be?
Yes, sir.
So the question is whether, if I'm not mistaken, Doug, whether the multiplier is above 1 or below 1, and that's where very, very few people say it's below 1. Is that not the case? And then, what was the Bernstein multiplier?
The question of whether the Recovery Act was good for the economy is a question of whether the multiplier is above or below 0.
0. Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. 0.
And so, can I just put into the transcript on this regard? There's a collection of economists at the University of Chicago who do a regular survey of distinguished economists at leading universities on issues of public policy to show where the agreements lie in the disagreements.
Whether a dollar spending produces more than a dollar's worth of economic output or less, right? That's basically the question.
So I'll read you the specific question they asked. Because of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, the U.S. unemployment rate was lower at the end of 2010 than it would have been without the stimulus bill.
Now, did Mr. Hughes
get the answer to that question?
No, sorry, I thought you did.
That was the question. The question was with a question mark at the end. The statement, they phrased it as a statement. I'm just quoting it directly. Because of the Recovery Act, the unemployment rate was lower at the end of 2010 than it would have been without the stimulus bill. 80% of the respondents, 80% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement.
Right. So
only 4% disagreed or strongly disagreed.
Right, meaning positive number versus negative number, 80%.
And I'm not sure if John Taylor's in this group. If he were, I presume he'd be in the 4%. But that is a distinct minority.
Right, so here's what I think he's getting at.
Consistent with the consensus in the profession.
What was the multiplier? I think it was the Bernstein, Romer, I can't recall who came up with the multiplier to generate those stimulus projections. What was that multiplier they used to generate those projections? Was it 2 point something, wasn't it?
I don't know what they did. What we did, and we report...
No, I know, but what he's getting at is, how did they get it so wrong off their projections? And my question is, what was the multiplier that they used, and was that multiplier not outside of the realm of what most economists thought it would have been?
So I just don't know what they used. I know what we did. We went through the literature. We looked at a set of multipliers from the evidence the economists have generated. We reported what those multipliers are.
And yours is 1 point something, right?
Well, for every sort of provision, the multiplier is different, and we've talked about the differences. I think for the Recovery Act as a whole, and of course a part of the Recovery Act was tax cuts, all spending increases.
Temporary.
I think in the end we thought the multiplier on average across those provisions was about 1, very rough terms. And that's what we've been reporting in our regular reports.
And to his point, I'm doing this off the top of my head. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Bernstein-Romer multiplier. I forgot who. I think it was Bernstein. That was 2 something, was it not? Joyce, do you know the answer to that? No.
It may have been. It may have been. I just don't know.
I think that's what he's trying to get.
We are not trying to.
No, I understand that. I just
rebut what they do. We did our own analysis, and I can speak to that. I can't speak to what the administration did.
But Mr. Chairman, just since we're now over the time, I mean, the question is pretty simple. The question is whether or not the recovery bill, the stimulus bill, helped the economy relative to not doing a stimulus. And the answer from CBO and 80% of the economists is that it helped the economy.
Right, and what Mr. Hillscamp is getting at is the claims that were used to sell the stimulus were based on a multiplier that clearly did not materialize, which was much higher than what CBO claimed it would be. We'll go to the record and figure out what that was. I think it was 2.1 or something like that.
Sell it. We started doing our analysis.
We're not suggesting you're selling anything. We're suggesting the administration was selling something and they oversold it.
But just to be, I mean, I just invite everybody to look at the Congressional Budget Office analysis on this exact issue that's been raised a couple times, which made clear that as a result of the recovery bill, we've saved or created over 3 million jobs. They talk about it on a year-by-year basis, and for those people that have those jobs, it's pretty meaningful.
And the administration claimed unemployment would never get above 8, that millions more jobs would have been created, and they plugged in a multiplier that very few economists support or justify. Mr. McClintock.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, what we have...
Can I say one more thing? Just to,
not on my time.
Congressman Hulskamp, we are doing a report right now on the slow recovery. We are trying, in fact, ourselves to understand better where we went wrong in an effort to improve our forecast going forward. And we're writing this up in a way that will be available to you and your colleagues, I hope, within a few months, as part of our preparation for our August forecast update.
Mr. Chairman, I request 30 seconds to close.
No, I actually started the mantra after your time expired.
No, you did not. I gave you my time. I didn't.
Oh, you're right. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that. And you know, I wasn't around here, and I'm going with the numbers that were provided by the administration. It says it's 5.7%. That's in writing. It was so far off, it might have been different multipliers. But as we go forward, and I look forward to that report, one thing I will ask as well to put in the report, if you can make an estimate, as Mrs. Black indicated, what's the economic impact of uncertainty? Because I'm hearing that from job creators, and that's nowhere in your report, and that's a difficult thing to measure. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. I apologize. Thanks for the indulgence. Mr. McClintock.
It reminds me of the economist who said, well, that might be true in practice, but how does it work in theory? I think we've run afoul of McClintock's first law of political physics, which is the more we invest in our mistakes, the less willing we are to admit them. A corollary of that is the conceit of the left that somehow a consensus determines science or economics. The sad fact of the matter is, if 80% of the economists turn out to be wrong, the fact it was 80% of them doesn't make it right. It is still wrong. And that's been the experience that we've had, and why your testimony is being greeted with a certain degree of skepticism now. With respect to the question of default, doesn't the Secretary of the Treasury have the authority to prioritize payments to assure the timely payment of the government's sovereign debt obligations?
I think that's right, Congressman.
I think it is too. So does the GAO. In fact, I think it's embedded in the original act that established the Department of the Treasury. So sovereign debt default then would not be an act of the Congress. It would be a malfeasance of the executive in not prioritizing payments to assure timely payment of our sovereign debt obligations.
I'm sorry, Congressman. I can't speak to the legalities of this. I can speak, I think, to our sense of the economic consequences.
Ms. Castor called the budget passed by the House last year a disaster. I recall Standard & Poor's warning that a deficit reduction of $7 trillion from the baseline over the next 10 years was what was necessary to preserve the AAA credit rating of the United States government. I specifically asked the head of their sovereign debt division if the budget adopted by the House last year, the so-called Ryan budget, would have preserved the AAA credit rating of the United States government. His answer was it would have. Do you have any reason to contradict that?
I have no view on that one way or the other, Congressman.
So we could have preserved the AAA credit rating of the United States government, but I have some friends on the left who seem to think that's a disaster. That's a question of value that I know you can't.
Speak to what Standard & Poor's.
But let me talk about the relationship between tax and deficit, if I could. Tax has often been put forward as an antidote to deficits. You've essentially said that in your testimony. But aren't taxes and deficits basically the same thing? I mean, isn't a deficit simply a future tax? Aren't taxes and deficits the only two possible ways of paying for spending?
I think that's right, Congressman. Certainly, and as you know, in the long run, one can't just continue to run up deficits either. In the long run, we need to bring our spending and our taxing into rough correspondence with each other. But you're right.
Well, but a deficit's a future tax.
Borrowing today commits us.
Whether you're taxing today or you're taxing tomorrow, which is what we call a deficit, you're still taxing, and those are the two ways that you pay for spending. So it seems to me that with apologies to the Clinton campaign, it's the spending stupid.
Well, Congressman, I think when we run up a debt today, that does commit us to doing either more taxation or less spending in the future. But which of those it is depends on the decisions of the Congress.
Can you offer us any examples of a nation that has ever spent and borrowed and taxed its way to prosperity?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, Congressman. I mean, prosperity comes ultimately from the ability of an economy to produce goods and services. It's from the amount and quality of the labor force. It's the amount and nature of the capital stock.
Right.
It's productivity and so on. Those are the drivers of productivity.
Going from theory to actual practice. I look back over the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, and I see Harding reducing spending as a percentage of GDP in the early 20s, Truman reducing it in the mid-1940s, Reagan reducing it in the mid-1980s, and Clinton reducing it in the mid-1990s, and each period follows or is followed by a rather dramatic expansion of the nation's economy. And yet I see when spending is dramatically increased, Hoover in the late 20s, early 30s, Roosevelt throughout the 30s, Bush in the 2000s, the economy has languished. What are we to draw from the practical experience that is quite consistent over the past century?
I think the practical experience is harder to interpret than you're suggesting, Congressman. If one looks, for example, across European countries, you asked, I know different countries and how they performed. I have a table in front of me. Germany, which is one of the stronger European economies, being relied on by others in Europe today, they have a much larger share of GDP collected in tax revenue before this downturn.
But again, tax revenue, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about spending as a percentage of GDP.
They have higher spending than we do. There are countries in Europe that have all sorts of different spending and tax policies, and some have performed
Actually, I think I just saw a chart that actually measured in per capita dollars, per capita spending in the United States is higher than it is in those European countries.
We're richer than they are. So a share of our GDP goes further in dollars.
We continue these policies, we can fix that in a hurry, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Mr. Ginta. Yeah, go ahead.
I know I'm using your time, Mr. Chairman. Can I just say, you referred, Congressman, to whether people invest in errors and then aren't willing to admit them. I'm not sure if you're referring to our analysis or to policy making, but I'd like to just say on behalf of our analysis that we continue to read the literature, and we have in fact adjusted our range of estimates of the effects of the Recovery Act in response to what we have learned through that process. But we have not adjusted the range to include effects below zero, because we don't think that is consistent with the evidence, and only 4% of the economists seem to think it is, and 80% in this survey think it isn't. So again, although we do respond to the evidence and are not afraid to admit that, we're very clear when we change our views and why. We think, again, with a great majority of economists, the Recovery Act was on net good for the economy over the past few years.
Thanks, Mr. Ginta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Was the stimulus bill, the Recovery Act, the only way that we could have helped the economy or
No, Congressman. I mean, there were a whole collection of possible alternative policies that could have been enacted. And when we've been asked a number of occasions now by the Senate Budget Committee to look at alternative ways of providing a boost to the economy, we've offered a menu of options, and we've discussed what we think the likely effects would be and the pros and cons of different ways of proceeding. So there are many, many different policies.
And is it also fair to say the Recovery Act did add to the deficit?
Yes, that's right.
And it did add to the debt?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So what is the effect of borrowing money going into debt and deficit have on private sector capital?
Well, over the medium term and long term, that extra debt will crowd out private capital formation, as we've said. And we said this in February of 2009, that the Recovery Act would be, as was then being discussed, would be good for the economy in the short run, but absent other changes, would be a drag later on.
So as I look at the President's budget proposal for the next decade, I seem to recall seeing, I think, every year for the next 10, our deficit exceeds $1 trillion. And then our long-term debt continues to grow. Now, I don't know what percentage of the GDP that is off the top of my head. So to your point, that at some point in the long term, which is what this report talks about, we do have to change, as you said, the ratio of debt to GDP, and we've got to change our tax revenue to our expenditures. Now, it is suggested by some that the way to do that is to increase taxes. If we increase taxes, let's say we increase every single tax rate, does that necessarily suggest we're going to have more long-term revenue to the Treasury?
Well, in general, Congressman, higher tax rates will lead to more revenues, not proportionately higher because there'll be some effect on people's behavior, but in general, higher tax rates will, from the levels the U.S. is starting from today or has been talking about over the next decade, increases from that point would lead to more revenues in general. Now, could we find specific taxes where that wasn't true? Perhaps. I don't know, and we haven't checked in that way.
So there is an alternative then to just raising tax rates, to trying to fix and solve this problem. We have what's our revenue today? 2.2 trillion?
You think I would know that, Congressman, but I don't.
So it's roughly 2.2.
Revenues, we think this year the revenues will be about $2.5 trillion.
$2.5 trillion. But we will spend 3.5,
spend about
3.6?
Okay. Yeah, about 3.5, a little over $1 trillion.
So we're still looking at a $1 trillion deficit.
We are.
The other
don't
point,
think that will persist at that level under current law, or in fact under the President's budget. But the President's budget does have larger deficits than under current law.
one of the things I do want to try to get on the record, and you may have talked about it before, so I apologize if you have. In terms of health care entitlements, the CBO report says 5.4% of GDP of that spending in 2012, which goes up to 12% of GDP by 2050. So that is clearly a driver of our long-term fiscal problems, is it not?
Well, that's the thing that's different from the past. That's the part that means that we can't repeat the policies of the past. Again, whether that's addressed by you and your colleagues through changes in those programs or other spending or taxes is up to you. And the fiscal problem, the imbalance, just comes from the gap, not particularly from either side or the other.
However, if we were to eliminate 100% of discretionary spending, we'd still have we'd still have a current deficit, and we'd still have long-term debt problems.
I haven't tried the complete elimination, but as I said, Congressman, when I started, changes one makes in programs outside of the health care program for Social Security can affect the magnitude of the changes needed in taxes or the large entitlement programs. But it doesn't eliminate the basic trade-off that we need to either change taxes relative to their historical performance, change these programs relative to current law, or do some combination of those.
Would you be able to comment on what the unfunded liability numbers are in mandatory, on the mandatory side?
I don't know, Congressman. We don't calculate unfunded amounts in dollar terms like that. We generally show projections as shares of GDP, and we show some imbalances in the Social Security Trust Fund, and we show a fiscal gap for the economy as a whole. But it's not that's just the gap between spending and revenues. It's not meant to capture the present value of all future spending or all future revenues.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes all member questions. Dr. Elmendorf, again, thank you and your team, Joyce and your team, for all your hard work in putting this very insightful, very harrowing report together, and this hearing is adjourned.